All right, so a pretty specific topic today. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us, taking a little bit of time over what is, for some of us, our lunch hour, on the East Coast at least. We're going to talk about migrating your file shares to SharePoint Online. I'm going to go back to the presenter view. Most of you have probably met our team. We bring a wide-ranging range of skills and, better yet, opinions on these subject matters. Today is the Todd show, right? So we're going to focus on migrating file shares to SharePoint Online, and kind of not only the why but the how. And I think we'd like to get to some. We were describing it earlier as worst practices, right? It's too late for me, save yourself kind of lessons that we've learned over time in doing this. So Todd, you want to talk about why?
Yeah. So this was one we do a lot of migrations. I do a lot of migrations, and so this was one that we kind of wanted to talk about. And it's part of like one of the most fulfilling things that I do. I really enjoy getting people into Office 365, and so this is one of those things. It's like birthing new babies into the world. It's getting things in. So the why is because you can. Like that's why you would move all your stuff in. Now, people sometimes need more justification for that, for themselves or for whoever. So we put some things in there. Specifically, migrating from file shares to SharePoint just opens up a whole world. I mean, if you think about file shares, they've been around since like the 80s, and technology has come a long way since then. So now when you get into SharePoint, you've got versions and workflows and all the things we've listed there. And so like I just like why. My question is more like why not? Like why do file shares even exist anymore?
And as SharePoint aficionados, we love all the goodness on the left hand of the screen, left hand side of the screen here, right? We're well versed in all this and we're really excited about it. But somebody who's only used file shares, they'll never miss what they never had.
Yeah.
So usually what the triggering event might be I'm running out of storage, or I've got a storage device that is approaching end of life, coming off lease, whatever the case may be. Really like basic, simple, stupid reasons for it to happen that provide also all the benefits that Todd points out. And sometimes the merger integration. Company gets bought, the old file system isn't going to get used. There's a higher level of maturity in SharePoint at the new co, so they get all these benefits.
Yeah, and a lot of times we've done migrations for companies who have been forced into it because of things like regulations. So there are certain industries that have types of regulations, financial, things like that, and file shares just can't meet those needs or can't meet them very easily. And so people get thrust into Office 365 and SharePoint because of the regulations. And then we get to tell them all these other things. And it's, I forget what all the rest of the slides are, but getting into some of those things where people are just expecting to have a file share like experience, and I'm like, no, we've got versions. When Mike screws a document up, I can roll it back to the previous version. We've got that option now, and just watching those light bulbs come on as people get ideas. I'm an IT guy. I didn't always used to be a SharePoint guy, but the external access bit is a huge part also. In the bad old days when dinosaurs roamed the earth and we had everything on file shares, if you had somebody, even an on-prem SharePoint site, if you wanted to give somebody else external access or give employees external access, man, it was a lot of work and it was scary. And now with Office 365, it's just out there by default. And so now it's really easy to do those kind of things. So there's a lot of great reasons to do it.
I might add there's the one consideration in an organization where you don't want to consider this, and that's where you're talking about like imaging solutions or systems that have local file storage or even cloud file storage for things that aren't really meant to be in the Microsoft 365 platform, right? Like if you're in biotech and you do research, there might be imaging files and lots of different things like that you wouldn't be looking to migrate. So
that's a great point, Julie. Like large
frame
binaries.
This. Yeah, we should frame this around, business related content, maybe. I don't really know how else to say it, but things that belong in the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, I guess.
great point, Julie. I've talked to a lot of engineering companies who have large binaries like BIM files and CAD files and the like that aren't super conducive to use in SharePoint. Like SharePoint's gotten better over the years at dealing with blobs, but there's still a lot of native stuff that you can do with file systems and other apps on top of them. Like, what is it? Sync. There's sync tools. There's Nasuni. There's other tools like that handle those large binaries better than we do in SharePoint and OneDrive.
Yeah, and I will say
that's getting better too, because they're doing differential syncs. If you sync that a library with some of those large files down locally, they don't sync the whole thing. So they're the dreaded shred word.
Yep.
They sync shreds of the file. I think they stopped using that word for good reason.
Yeah, I will say that I think everything should go into SharePoint, but I will begrudgingly acknowledge that there are some things that don't go as well into SharePoint, to Julie and to this point. But it's like my default position is everything should go in, and then sometimes I let people make arguments that it shouldn't go in. But
and we'll Todd it.
That's so nice of you.
I'm firm but fair.
Okay, and Todd, this kind of begs your next point of it's not all or nothing, right?
Yeah, and for this one, this slide was very much about which tool to use, but it also pertains to the information itself. It's not all the information or none, and that's kind of what the tool thing was. So I get asked a lot which tool people should use, and that depends a lot on what your situation is, and we'll tackle a little bit about that here. But one of the things that I always want to mention when I'm talking about what method or what tools or whatever is that decision doesn't have to be for the entire tenant or for the entire migration. We have done a lot of migrations in the past where we had data that would go very easily, so we used one method for that, but then other data that needed to be transformed in some way, so we would use another method for that, and that's perfectly fine. So as we're talking about these, keep that in mind that this isn't, I'm not saying do this for the entire migration, but if there's slices that make sense, you can. So I've kind of got this in order of best idea to or worst idea to best idea, or small to large, whatever. But one thing that I always want to mention is you can just drag files into the interface. Like, you can create a SharePoint site, have your document library open, and go to Windows Explorer and just drag files in. Like, it's just that simple. And there are some instances where that makes sense. For smaller customers, we've had people do that for their personal drives, their H drive or M drive or whatever it is. Migrating things over, you tell people not to bring everything, but you have that option. Now, when people do that, they have a tendency to abuse it and drag too many things in, but that is one way to get things in, is just drag it and drop it right into the web page. Another way to do it that's kind of not a migration tool, but is the OneDrive sync client. So you can, obviously that syncs your OneDrive, your personal drive, but it also syncs all of the other SharePoint document libraries that you have. So one way to get content up there is to, create your SharePoint site, create your document library, sync that down to your local machine, and then just drag files over to that in your file system, and then they will get synced up to the cloud. So those are not big enterprise-worthy considerations, but for sometimes those onesie twosie things, it's better than firing up a tool and doing a thing and all that. Kind of next down the line is the PNP PowerShell. So I very much live in a world where everything is a nail, that the PNP PowerShell, when I've got that hammer and everything looks like a nail. There is a lot of times when I've written tools like that. So I will use PowerShell for different parts of the migration. The great thing about PowerShell is once you get familiar with all these PNP commandlets, you can do a lot of amazing things with it. So if we transform files, rename them on the fly, or put them in folders, or add metadata or whatever, I've definitely done that. And that really has come in handy for situations where I was migrating, maybe not out of file shares, but out of other systems that weren't SharePoint. And so the files needed to be massaged in a way that was, I could have had to do manually, but instead use PowerShell. But you can absolutely write a pretty simple PowerShell script where you point it at a file share and you say, get all the child items, recurse, and then add PNP file and stuff them in SharePoint somewhere. So that's also an option. They're also then kind of next on the tree is the free solutions that Microsoft provides. And they've got a couple of them. We're all familiar with the SharePoint migration tool. And there's also a tool that does assessment. And we didn't add that here, but the migration assessment tool. And that the assessment tool will do things like look at your file shares and see if you've got names that won't work or paths that are too long, things like that. But then you've also got the SharePoint migration tool that will migrate that content from the file share up to SharePoint. And that one is free and not horrible, gets better all the time, certainly way better than it was a couple of years ago when it first came out.
Hey, Todd, does the assessment tool do anything with metrics around usage of content, last accessed, frequency of usage, number of users, et cetera?
No, it doesn't, and that is so that almost should have shown up on one of my first slides. That's been one of the things where I've done file share migrations. The file share itself doesn't handle all of that data. Like there's just not all those things because you're just hitting a file share. There's no real server in there. Right. And so I've seen companies that have had to employ third-party solutions to that go through and check files and check last modifieds and all that kind of thing. And for regulatory reasons or whatever, SharePoint does all that out of the box. So there's no great way for the assessment tool to get that. You can get a point in time, but it doesn't keep any kind of database to compare that. So I've not seen that there.
Yeah, just thinking about there's often a step in here that's like an assessment of rot, right?
Yeah.
Content that's redundant, obsolete, or trivial. And I just I think there was a link to that Microsoft assessment tool in here. I'll put it back in before we publish these.
Oh. Okay. Yeah, and that's one thing, and I can't remember what the slide, if we've got a slide on what content to move in or not, but that is one thing to consider. And I tend to err on the side of moving a lot more in than probably other people do, just because, I don't know, I'm a hoarder by nature, and so getting rid of files, you never know when you're going to need that piece of information. But certainly you should consider bringing, going through your files and triaging them, and maybe everything doesn't make the cut. Everything doesn't get to go live in SharePoint.
Yeah, it used to be we would have. Sorry, Emily. It used to be we would have a lot of discussion about, well, we don't have much disk space, so we can only move so much into SharePoint. And now when we're going to the cloud, it's more like, well, don't throw this away if you don't know if you need it. We'll move it in, and then you can prune it out later, which often never happens. But it's a lot less of a forced pruning exercise. I think moving file shares into earlier versions of SharePoint on-prem was often a big negotiation.
Yeah. Now, there are other considerations. The drive space one, like you said, is not much of a consideration now, but there is considerations around things like whether it's going to muck up search if you've got too many versions of files and things like that. There are also legal concerns because it's now a lot easier to keep track of old documents, and the lawyers are very specific. Some things you have to keep them for 7 years, and then you want them to be deleted 7 years in a day because then you don't want them around for discovery purposes and things like that. So that's another great reason to move into SharePoint is because you can automate all that and set up rules. But yeah, pruning those out is a good idea too.
Todd, I had a question here about there's free Microsoft software, there's third-party software, but I think there's some sort of point at which ShareGate changes from free to paid. Can we talk about that a little bit? Because I know there's stuff you can do with ShareGate for free.
Yeah, let me finish with the last Microsoft free one.
Mover stuff, got it.
Yeah. So a couple of years ago, Microsoft bought Mover.io, which was another SharePoint migration tool. Mover did a bunch of things. They've got connectors, so whatever. Microsoft mainly bought them to do cloud-to-cloud things, so like Box to Office 365, Google to 365. But Mover also does do file shares. So I don't know that I would recommend it for file shares, but if you're already consolidating and moving things from one place to another, know that Mover.io does have a file share connector, and you could use that if you wanted to. So onto the third-party software, like Mike said, there's kind of a free and all that. I always think of ShareGate as a paid option, and there's some demo stuff, and I don't know if there's any freeware functionality with it. But anytime I position it to a customer, it's always about the paid version. And especially since I've just spent a bunch of time talking about free versions, sometimes it can be difficult to bring in paid software, because then the immediate question is, why would I pay for this if there's all these free options? And it's like the old joke about Linux. Linux is only free if you don't value your time. And ShareGate is kind of, these other tools are kind of the same way. ShareGate,
it's free like a puppy.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So what ShareGate does, what it gives you for your money is it gives you a lot of your time back. It lets you automate things. So I gave the example of how you could write some PowerShell to modify files as they came in, add metadata, rename them, things like that. You can do all that, and I have done all that. ShareGate also does all that. So you can pick your copy job, and there's a bunch of different ways to do it, but you could say, all these documents, we had this really nasty long file share path. We're not going to do that in SharePoint. So we're going to put them nice, flat structure, but we're going to add a bunch of metadata. So when these files come across, give them these tags, and ShareGate just does it, and you don't have to fiddle with it. Renaming them, reownering them, all kinds of things like that. So one of the things that ShareGate gives you is time and faith in the process, because you can do these things 100,000 times against 100,000 files and trust that it all works the same. So I'm a big fan of that. The other thing is, I recognize that not everybody has 2 or 3 PowerShell windows open all day, every day. And so, some of those things that I can do easily in PowerShell, maybe other people don't want to fuss with. And so ShareGate gives you that as well. So Mark, are there any free pieces of functionality that come with that, or is it always just pay?
It's all pay. Yep.
Okay.
I see that price as being nominal given the benefit you get out of it, but still, it's a bunch of change that you have to invest.
Yeah.
Not to mention the fact that once you buy ShareGate for your migration, you now have it for all these other great administrative things after the fact.
Exactly. Yep.
Great point. Yep.
Yeah, and that's something that came up, a couple of months ago when we were talking about the workflows being retired, the SharePoint 2010 workflows are being retired. Microsoft, again, had a free tool, the migration tool, or the modernization tool, that you could run, and it was some command line stuff, and you had to do a bunch of things. Or if you had ShareGate, there's just a report in there, give me all the, the workflows, and it was just done. So to Ed's point, there's, and ShareGate has to do that because they recognize that if they only sell migration products, they're only going to get your money once. So they need to find a way to keep getting your money. So they've added some great administrative things in there too.
Quick question from Melissa, and I don't know if anybody has hands-on experience with it in the chat about using DocAv. If anybody has experience with DocAv and comparing it to ShareGate.
I legitimately have not used DocAv in like 10 years. So
yeah, that's been around a really long time.
I used it, but it was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And I found it so complicated. So I don't know. That question is interesting. ShareGate is significantly simpler than what I remember. I will put that out there.
Yeah. ShareGate
I think
is very simple, even
I think we've all used it.
Users.
Yeah, I'm not nearly as technical as most everybody. It's some practice on this call, and I've used ShareGate successfully before.
Yeah.
Krista also said there's another one called Content Matrix. Since we're talking about third-party tools, has anybody? I have never heard of that one, so I don't have a comment.
That wasn't Exceller's product, right? That got bought by, or that's part of Metalogix now.
I don't know. Loose. It was.
Okay. Yeah.
So
not a fan.
Yeah.
Let's go
it
use
used
that
to be
one.
owned by Metalogix, and it was I think they were bought out by Quest.
That's who bought
Right.
Metalogix, right? So it's Exceller had like DaVinci and a migration tool, and then Metalogix bought them, and then Quest bought Metalogix.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
just
sure there are
curious
other players out there.
Yeah, I'm
but
just curious if anyone's what their experience has been with it. I've used it a few times and have had good and bad experiences. Some of the same horror ones that Lou has experienced. Just curious what your thoughts are on it if you've used it.
I think the fact that we've collectively decided strategically to partner with ShareGate as a best of breed solution for this says a fair amount, because each of us has 10 plus years of doing stuff with SharePoint and knew some of these other tools and worked in it. But if anyone else from Simpraxis wants to comment on specifics.
Well, when they first came out with ShareGate, they really focused. Oh, actually, they were the second iteration of ShareGate. We don't need to think about the first one. The second iteration, they really focused on the user experience first, and so they built something that site owners and site admins could use, and it would make sense to them. And that's been one of their underlying tenets the whole way along. So it's not designed for an IT pro in a closet working with it. It's designed for site owners, and you see the big difference in the UI there.
Yeah, and that was smart of them, because a lot of the engagements that we do now are not always with IT. It is some other group inside of the business that's driving the migration completely to Office 365 or to pieces of it. And so, yeah, I don't feel too bad about saying to somebody who's not in IT, you should get this tool ShareGate, and here's why.
Well, and that empowers them as well. As a business user, they're the ones to understand the content that needs to get moved. And so if you can sort of train and empower them, and then they have this tool, they can start doing some of that work themselves and getting other people involved in their organization that is the right person to make decisions, and then make those decisions themselves, versus having an external group of people trying to make the decisions for them, and then that back and forth of that. Not to say that that's not a very collaborative process, but at the very least, you can bring the tools to the people who can make the decisions best sometimes in the right scenario.
I see Ed's got his hand up. Did you have something, Ed?
Yeah, I'd actually be really interested in if there are resources available on that flattening structure and importing the metadata piece, because that's one of the things that I know has been a big concern for those users that I have that want to move from shared drives to SharePoint Online. That their folder structure is way too deep.
Yeah, and
I'll second that.
I don't remember if we've got a slide on that or not, but that is one of the biggest barriers. So one of the things that I wanted to do for today's session was to give you guys a bunch of things you could run off with. So these are all links and all that. But the thing that we were talking about, the thing that Ed asked about, is kind of a philosophical thing, where when you've had people who've been using file shares, and let's be honest, if they're using file shares, they've been using them for a decade or two, so they're very entrenched in that process, is trying to move them over to using a different way, using the browser instead of using Explorer, and using something instead of using folders. That is a tough sell, and it's really tough on users. So again, to call back to what Julie just said, if you've got some non-IT folks using ShareGate and involved, they're kind of your generals out in the field. But Ed, one of the things you have to do, and we do this with all of our customers, is when they're making this move, we just have to spend some time, with a virtual whiteboard, and say, what does this folder structure mean? What do users infer as they move down this file structure? Here's how we would do it in SharePoint. And so maybe that means separate site collections. Maybe that means a couple of document libraries. We really try hard not to use a lot of folders in SharePoint, but one level is not horrible. 2 if you catch me on a good day, but you definitely don't want to have the 15 or 20 that we see in file shares. So that's one of those things, like Julie said, having people involved that actually use the data, you have to have them in the conversation, because then you can take how they're used to using it and try to find the best way in SharePoint to do it and flatten it out. But that's a tough one.
Todd, some of the tools you talked about, either if you're writing custom PowerShell, or if you're using ShareGate, or some of the other ones, you can use those tools to get metadata based on, say, the file path.
Yeah.
Right. So you can start to do that inference of the metadata to replace the metadata that you're getting by drilling down the tree.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that we use ShareGate for a lot, and this was one of the battles that Mark and I have had. We had one customer who was migrating not out of a file share, but out of another document management system that had a lot of folders and all that, and we were bringing them up to speed on metadata. And as we were looking at how to do that, I'm like, oh, this is going to be easy. We can do the thing. I can write the PowerShell, and it'll go through, and all this kind of stuff. And Mark's like, just use ShareGate. I'm like, nah, I think you'll see that I can do a lot of things with PowerShell. And he's like, just use ShareGate. And so ShareGate has this ability, or this functionality, when you get the files, even if they're already in SharePoint, you can do an export of the structure and you get a spreadsheet of all the files, and you can just fill in the metadata in the spreadsheet and then just have ShareGate apply it to the files that are already there. And if you screw something up, you can do it again. But you've got this spreadsheet, so it's a tool you're used to using. So that's one way that we've used to really get the metadata down right.
Emily posted the link to doing that too in the chat. So.
Oh, yeah, the bulk edit metadata, yeah. So that is, because that's one of the things that we've had problems with is, yes, we should do it, but man, the work involved with tagging all this stuff is really tough. It's not as bad. Like Derek said, some of these tools can pull that out just by the folder structure and that, and then we've got this spreadsheet option.
So Todd, in the interest of time, I flipped us over to the how. We were already talking about some of these some of these topics, like the IA restructuring, et cetera. Is there anything else you want to make sure we underscore here for folks?
Yeah, so one of the things that Julie brought up when we were talking about this was the new SharePoint syntax. And if you've gone to any of the SharePoint conferences in the last couple of years, you've seen these demos where they upload a PDF and syntax pulls the metadata out just based on what it knows about the document. So that might also be a way to get some metadata. We haven't played with that, but as we were kind of kicking things around, that was something.
Yeah, it depends. If you have a file share that's got all kinds of different stuff in it, like 10 years or 20 years worth of stuff, syntax isn't likely to be a huge help unless your content sort of falls into some very consistent bucket. But if you have a file share that contains, invoices going back 10 years, then that would be an excellent candidate for some, getting some metadata out of those things using syntax.
Yeah. One thing to consider, because this is in the cloud, it does make it really easy for you to share with external people, sometimes too easy. And so outside of the whole how we're moving it and what we're moving and what we're going to make it look like, there are some security considerations that you have to think about. Just step back and say, how do we want it to work? How do we want to do that? Do we want to have external permissions, external sharing, things like that? And then part of that permissioning thing is your information architecture. In file shares, it was pretty common to change permissions at folder levels and all that kind of spidering. SharePoint can do that, but we try not to do that. So now you're going to have to do that step back and say, okay, we've got this big folder. Is it the same people that have the permissions here? Maybe this should be a site collection instead of having all these broken permissions, things like that. So it definitely helps when you've got somebody who uses the data and somebody who understands SharePoint, so you can kind of try to translate between the two, but those are considerations also. Do we have another slide?
Well, it was the open one. It was the open question. We have a few minutes left, and it was, what are some of the worst practices? What are the just palpably stupid things that we've seen people do or done ourselves and are willing to share? Related to file share migrations to SharePoint. Let's be more specific.
Darn.
Yeah, there's a refrain of the.
I was like.
I will say I did have a client once want to. Basically, in their migration, they moved everything to one giant document library. Oh. Everything from all their file shares into one single document library and one site collection, just preserving every folder, every document, every version. They were still using that same structure like 5 years after they did it because nobody bothered.
Well, and that actually that's a kind of project we do where like I can think of five clients right now where there's this giant document library that 5 years ago they moved into everything from their file shares, and now they want to move into a digital organization, and that's not it.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the biggest error that I see when people moving from file shares is just not wanting to fix that and just wanting to do the much maligned lift and shift method of just we'll sort it out later.
Yeah.
No, you won't.
You won't.
It'll never happen.
Yeah, that's I would say in migrations.
And that both what Mike just typed and what Todd just said is a lot of it's about thinking about life cycles. right? What is the life cycle of a document? And as humans, we tend to be pack rats, so we just keep everything because we can. That's why you don't need all of those old documents. You want to think about what for each content type, and yes, we can use content types. What's a beginning and what's a middle and what's an end of the life cycle of one of those things, so that you can get rid of the stuff that no longer matters. File shares are really, really bad for that.
Yeah, and as you can say, and that's something that people never considered in file shares because you really didn't have the option. You couldn't do workflows and all that kind of thing. Yeah.
Ed, you win our pity party award for the 300 gig document library in the destination.
Well, at least I'm down to just that one. I had another group that literally has a Office 365 group that has run out of their 1 terabyte storage, and it's all in one document library.
Okay.
Oh, Jesus. Ouch.
So feel the pain. Luckily, that got transitioned to a different support team, and I don't have to deal with it.
Oh my God.
It's very different, but probably 5 or 6 years ago at one of the SP Tech Cons in Boston, I was doing a session and somebody told me that they were running the free version of WSS, which had the little Windows internal database, and that they had a terabyte in there. Wow. And I called him out and I told him they were lying. And so he VPN'd his workplace and showed me that. And I'm like, okay, that is the scariest thing I've ever seen in my entire life.
Oh,
The Windows internal database with a terabyte site collection in it. Yeah.
All right, we're just about at time here. I did want to flip to next steps because I think we've got a really great topic for 2 weeks from now. But some of the resources that Todd alluded to are mentioned in line here. Easy to use links. Thank you, Emily, for shortening that one. That was ugly and unwieldy. And the next one is SharePoint is slow. What can we do about it, right? Most common user complaint about SharePoint. It's slow. It's not loading. So from an end user point of view, what can we do to diagnose this and ask intelligent questions of our IT pro brethren? As IT pros, what can we do about it? And as developers, what can we do about it? What are some of the tools for monitoring and improving performance in SharePoint? Any questions about anything we covered today? Still open? Or the next topic? Does anybody have any specific questions about SharePoint performance that you want to prompt us with or prime the pump with?
So I've seen that breaking permission inheritance all over the place can impact performance. I don't know if there's if that's just my experience or if there's documentation on that, because that's a pet peeve of mine, obviously, with a 300 gig document library.
Yeah, so that absolutely measurably, demonstrably happened in on-prem SharePoint. Like you could very easily have a document library, look at the page load, break inheritance on a single item, and watch that page load and measure that page load slower, sometimes like 10 times slower. So on-prem, that's definitely a concern. I don't know if it's a concern online anymore because that was a back-end thing. That was a SQL thing that caused that. And I think Microsoft has fixed that. And anytime you go to a document and you say, share this document, you're breaking inheritance, which everybody does 1,000 times a day in Office 365 now. So I think from a performance standpoint, the hit's not what you and I remember it being 10 years ago. From a security standpoint, it still kind of gives me the willies. But I think performance-wise, it's not a big deal.
Cool. And people can also do the Ask and Praxis form to submit any questions ahead of time they might have on this topic for next week, or in 2 weeks, excuse me. So that would be really helpful because it'll help us gather more information to answer questions better. So.
Yeah, this is a topic we could spend 4 hours on. So yeah. Your specific questions will help us focus it into something, distill it into a half-hour content. That's awesome. Right. Thank you, Todd, for the Todd Show.
No,
as always, thanks
pleasure.
Everybody for good questions and comments and for your thoughts. We're thrilled to have this be a discussion rather than a presentation. So you're crucial to this. We appreciate it. And if there's nothing else, we'll talk to you on December 16th.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.